The first thing I remember is the sound of his laugh. That quiet, breathless kind of laugh that never reached his eyes. Riley always laughed that way when he was trying to hide something. That afternoon, standing by the lake where the air smelled faintly of pine and regret, I realized I'd been chasing that sound my entire life. The sun was beginning to set behind the hills, throwing long shadows over the worn wooden pier. Riley was sitting on the edge, legs dangling above the water, a can of beer sweating beside him. I stood a few feet away, unsure whether to join him or keep my distance. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not really. Not since his cousin, Ethan, had cornered me at the summer festival and said the words that started all of this. "I like you, Quentin." Simple words, kind ones, but they had landed like stones in my chest because all I could think was, wrong cousin. Now Riley was here again, back in the place where we grew up, looking like every memory I'd tried to bury and every dream I'd never dared to name. He turned when he heard my footsteps. His expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered. A spark, a question, maybe even a warning. "You came," he said. "Yeah," I murmured. "You asked me to. I wasn't sure you would." I wasn't sure either. For a moment, the world was nothing but the sound of the lake lapping against the pier and the quiet ache between us. The last time we'd been this close was 3 years ago, the night before he left for college. I told him I was proud of him. He'd smiled, hugged me, and walked away, and I told myself that was enough. But it never was. He motioned toward the empty space beside him. "Sit." I hesitated, then lowered myself next to him. The boards creaked under our weight. I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm, just inches from mine. It was maddening how something so small could feel like standing on the edge of a cliff. "I heard about Ethan," he said after a while. "Word travels fast in small towns." I swallowed hard. "Yeah, he told me how he felt." Riley looked straight ahead. "And I turned him down." He nodded slowly. "Because I should have lied. It would have been easier for both of us. But the truth had been sitting in my throat for too long, sharp and heavy." "Because my heart's not free," I said quietly. "It hasn't been for a long time." Riley's lips twitched, almost into a smile, but it faded before it formed. "You mean someone else?" "Yeah. Anyone I know?" I laughed once, soft, broken. "You could say that." He turned to look at me then, really look. The fading sunlight caught the gold in his hair, the tension in his jaw. For a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. There was something in his eyes. Fear, hope, maybe both. And I felt like the world was holding its breath. Then he looked away. "Must be nice," he said, voice low. "Loving someone that long." "Depends," I whispered, "on whether they ever loved you back." The silence that followed was brutal. Every unspoken word between us hung heavy in the air. Riley ran a hand through his hair, exhaled, and said, "You always had a way of saying too much and not enough at the same time." I smiled faintly. "Guess that makes two of us." The lake shimmered gold, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. Like if I moved or spoke, the fragile piece would shatter. And maybe that's what we'd always been, a balance between what we wanted and what we were too afraid to reach for. Later, when the light dimmed and the cicadas began to sing, Riley finally said, "Ethan told me he confessed to you." "Yeah. He also told me you didn't give him a reason." "I didn't think he needed one. But you gave him one now." I turned to him. "Does it matter?" He hesitated, then said, "It does to me." There it was, the crack in his voice. The one thing I'd been waiting to hear, and the one thing I didn't know how to face. "I didn't mean to hurt him," I said. "I know, but you did." "I didn't mean to hurt you either." He looked startled. "Me? You think I don't know?" I said softly. "You think I didn't see it all those years? The way you looked at me when you thought I wasn't watching." His jaw tightened. "Quentin, don't," I said. "Don't lie now. Not after everything." He turned his face away, but I caught the flash of emotion in his eyes, raw and unguarded. "It wouldn't have mattered," he muttered. "You never would have looked at me that way." "Then why are we here?" I asked. that stopped him cold. The air between us trembled with everything we couldn't say. And for the first time in years, I saw it clearly, the truth I'd been running from. Riley wasn't just a memory or a mistake. He was the reason no one else had ever felt right. I stood, pacing to the edge of the pier, hands shoved deep in my pockets. I didn't turn Ethan down because I wanted to spare him. I turned him down because every time I looked at him, all I could see was you. Riley didn't move. The breeze picked up, rustling through the reeds. The lake reflected the last streaks of orange and pink across his face, and he looked heartbreakingly human, torn between wanting to believe and being too afraid to. "Say it again," he whispered. I turned to him. "What?" "That it was me." "It's always been you," I said, my voice barely holding steady. "Since the first summer we met. Since that night under the fireworks when you said we'd always be friends. Since every stupid argument, every silence, every time I watched you walk away." He closed his eyes. "You can't just say that now. I'm saying it because it's true." He stood slowly, his breath trembling. "Do you have any idea what it was like watching you with everyone else? Pretending I didn't care. Probably the same as watching you leave and trying to convince myself it didn't matter." He laughed bitterly. "God, we're pathetic. Maybe, but we're honest." He took a step closer, close enough that I could see the tiny scar on his chin from when he'd fallen off his bike when we were kids. "What happens now?" "I don't know." Riley searched my face, then exhaled. "You always were terrible at endings. Maybe this isn't one," I said quietly. He didn't answer, but his gaze softened. For a moment the world seemed to tilt. Everything in me pulling toward him, everything in him holding back. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was real. And after all these years, maybe that was enough. We stayed there long after the sun disappeared. The sky deepened into violet, the stars blinking awake above us. We talked about nothing and everything, the past, the things we missed, the people we'd pretended to be. At some point, Riley told me about the city, about how lonely it could be, how sometimes he'd catch himself wishing he were back here, in the quiet, with me. I told him about the farm, about how it felt smaller now that he was gone. Neither of us said what we really meant, that every road, every memory, led back to this. Around midnight, he said, "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't been so scared?" "All the time." He smiled, sad and knowing. "Figures." There was something in his tone that scared me. The sound of someone trying to say goodbye without saying the word. I turned to him, desperate to stop whatever was slipping between us. "Riley." He shook his head. "Don't. Not yet. Just stay a little longer." So I did. We sat in silence, our shoulders barely touching, and it felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. Because loving him had always been like this, a quiet war between wanting and restraint. When I finally drove home that night, the roads were empty, the radio low. Every song reminded me of him, of summers that never ended and promises that never quite came true. I thought about Ethan's words, his hurt, and the guilt that lingered like a shadow. But more than that, I thought about Riley's eyes when I told him the truth, that flicker of something fragile, like hope daring to breathe again. By the time I reached the house, the sky had turned pale gray with dawn. I parked the car, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes. It wasn't over. Not yet. Because some stories, the ones written in the quiet spaces between fear and love, don't end when you tell the truth. They begin there. The following morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my window. The storm must have rolled in overnight, washing the world clean. For a while, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of it. My chest still ached from everything I hadn't said, and everything I finally had. Riley's face kept flashing in my mind. The way he'd looked at me when I said it's always been him. The silence that followed. The 1,000 unspoken things that hung between us like the mist over the lake. I knew I couldn't leave it there. Not again. By noon, I was back in my truck, heading toward town. The roads were slick, the sky a dull gray, but I didn't care. I just needed to see him. To know that last night hadn't been some fragile illusion born of nostalgia and too many bottled-up years. When I reached his house, the lights were on. The porch looked the same as it always had. Chipped paint, a wind chime that never stopped singing, and that single fern his mom used to fuss over. I almost laughed at how ordinary it looked, given how much of my life had revolved around the person inside it. I hesitated for a moment before knocking. Riley opened the door in a faded hoodie and jeans, hair damp from the shower. His expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. "Quentin," he said softly, "you're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I admitted. He leaned against the frame. "Guess that makes two of us." For a second, neither of us moved. The rain made the air smell like earth and memory. I wanted to reach for him, but I didn't. Instead, I said, "Can I come in?" He nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the place felt smaller than I remembered, cozy, but quiet in that way that tells you a house has learned to live without laughter. Riley poured 2 mugs of coffee, setting one in front of me. His hands trembled slightly. "I didn't think you'd actually show up," he said. "I almost didn't," I admitted. "But then I realized I've been running from this for too long." He looked up, cautious. "From what?" "From you. From how I feel. From what it means." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what does it mean, Quentin? Because last night, it sounded like a confession, but I don't know if it was just guilt or—" "It wasn't guilt," I interrupted. "It was everything I've never been brave enough to say." Riley's eyes softened, but there was still a flicker of hurt. "You can't just show up years later and say these things like nothing happened. You left too, you know. You didn't chase me." "I know." My voice cracked. "And I've regretted it every day since." He looked away, staring into his coffee. "You don't get it, Quentin." I waited. I told myself you'd figure it out, that one day you'd call or write or just something. But you never did. So I moved on. Or I tried to. "I know you did. Then why come back now?" "Because you were always the ending I couldn't rewrite." He blinked, taken aback. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with everything we were finally saying. I took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens after that, it's your choice." Riley stood abruptly and walked to the window. Outside, the rain was falling harder now, streaking the glass like tears. "You think you can just come back here, say all this and walk away?" he said quietly. "I don't want to walk away." "Then what do you want?" I hesitated. "You, if that's still possible." He turned then, his expression raw, stripped of every mask he'd ever worn. "You have no idea how many times I dreamed of hearing that," he whispered. "But dreams have a way of hurting when they finally come true." "I don't want to hurt you." "Then don't make promises you can't keep." "I'm not. Not this time." For a long time he just stared at me, searching for something, maybe the truth beneath my words. And when he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. "Do you remember the night before I left?" I nodded. "How could I forget?" "You told me you were proud of me," he said, "and I told you I'd write. But what I wanted to say was, stay. I wanted you to ask me to stay." My throat tightened. "I know. And I wanted to. So why didn't you?" "Because I was scared. Because the idea of losing you hurt less than the idea of wanting you." He closed his eyes, exhaling. "You're still terrible at timing." "Yeah," I said, smiling weakly. "But maybe I'm getting better at honesty." Something in him shifted then. A small, fragile thing that felt like forgiveness. He walked toward me slowly, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed. When he stopped, he was close enough for me to feel the warmth of his breath. "You really mean it?" he asked. "Every word." His gaze dropped to my mouth, and for a second, the world narrowed to just the space between us. The heartbeat, the breath, the years of silence. Then he leaned in, hesitating for just a fraction of a moment before closing the distance. The kiss wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished or planned. It was clumsy and desperate and real, the kind of kiss that carries years of unsaid things, the kind that says finally. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine. "You have terrible timing," he murmured again, smiling through tears. "Guess it runs in the family," I said, laughing softly. He shook his head, but his laughter joined mine, quiet, trembling, alive. Outside, the storm began to fade, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. Light filtered through the clouds, pale and gentle. Felt like the world was breathing again. Riley stepped back, wiping at his eyes. So what now? I shrugged. We figure it out. Slowly. Together. He smiled then, really smiled, the kind I hadn't seen in years. You sure about that? I nodded. For once in my life, yeah, I'm sure. He looked at me for a long moment before saying, Okay, but you're making breakfast tomorrow. Deal. It wasn't a grand ending. There was no dramatic music, no sudden certainty that everything would be easy. But as we stood there, two people trying to rebuild something fragile and true, it felt like enough. Because maybe love isn't about perfect timing or perfect words. Maybe it's about showing up again and again, even when it's hard, even when it's late, even when you've already broken everything once before. And maybe, just maybe, it's about choosing to stay. The following days passed in a blur of rain and sunlight. Riley and I fell into a rhythm we hadn't known we missed. The kind that happens when two people stop pretending they don't care. We fixed the squeaky porch step together, argued over coffee strength, and fell asleep on the couch more than once with a movie still playing. It was easy, almost too easy, like stepping into a memory that never aged. But underneath the comfort was something fragile. The quiet fear that maybe this peace couldn't last. Every now and then, I'd catch Riley staring at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Not the way he used to, shy, uncertain, but with something softer. Something like belief. One morning, we drove out to the edge of town, to the same old lookout we used to sneak up to in high school. The world spread out beneath us. The winding roads, the silver stretch of the lake, the town that had both held and hurt us. Riley leaned on the hood of the truck, arms crossed. You ever think about leaving again? He asked. Sometimes, I admitted. But then I think about what I'd be leaving behind. He smiled faintly. This place hasn't changed much. No, I said. But maybe we have. He looked over at me, the wind ruffling his hair. I keep thinking about Ethan, he said. Yeah, I said quietly. I talked to him, Riley continued. Told him I knew. About you. I stiffened. And he's hurt, Riley said softly. But he'll be okay. He said he always kind of knew, even before I did. I nodded, staring at the horizon. He didn't deserve to get caught in the middle. No, Riley said. But that's the thing about love, isn't it? It catches everyone in its crossfire. I glanced at him, surprised. You sound like a poet. He laughed. Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to protect. We fell silent again, watching the light shift over the valley. The air smelled like rain and pine. Felt like closure, but also like beginning. After a while, Riley said, I used to think love had to be loud. You know, grand gestures, dramatic speeches, running through airports. And now I think it's just this. He gestured toward the world around us. Showing up, being here, staying when it's easier to go. I smiled. You're really going to make me fall for you all over again, aren't you? He looked at me then, really looked and said quietly, maybe that's the point. That evening we had dinner at his mom's old diner. It had changed hands since she passed, but the neon sign still flickered the same way, and the jukebox still played songs from 20 years ago. The waitress, a woman who'd known us since we were kids, smiled when she saw us together. Been a while since I've seen you two in here, she said, handing us menus. Yeah, Riley said. Guess we had some catching up to do. Her smile softened. Looks like you finally did. When she walked away, Riley chuckled. Small towns. They know everything before you do. Let them talk, I said. For once, I don't care. He looked at me, his expression unreadable, then reached across the table and brushed his fingers against mine. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable, but it felt monumental. For the first time, we weren't hiding. We ate, we laughed, and for a while, the years between us dissolved into the hum of conversation and the smell of coffee and pie. When we left, the sky was painted in deep blue and gold. We walked back to the truck in silence, our hands brushing now and then, like the world was slowly giving us permission to exist. That night, we drove to the lake. The same pier, the same quiet, only this time it didn't feel haunted. Riley sat with his knees pulled up, watching the moonlight ripple over the water. "You ever wonder what comes next?" he asked. "All the time," I said. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing is part of it." He turned to me, smiling faintly. "You always did find comfort in chaos. And you always found calm in everything I wasn't," I said. "Guess that's why we work." He laughed quietly. "Guess so." We sat there for a long time, saying nothing. The night was still, except for the soft lap of the water and the sound of our breathing. After a while, Riley said, "You know what's funny?" "What?" "I used to think you'd never love me the way I loved you. That maybe I was just another person in your story." I met his gaze. "You were the story." His eyes shimmered, catching the light. "Then I guess this is the part where we stop running." "Yeah," I said softly. "No more running." He leaned his head on my shoulder, and for the first time in years I felt still. Weeks turned into months. The world didn't magically fix itself. There were arguments, awkward mornings, and moments when the weight of the past came crashing back. But through it all, there was something steady, a quiet commitment to keep choosing each other, even when it wasn't easy. Some nights, Riley would stay up late working on designs for his job in the city, and I'd fall asleep on the couch beside him. Other nights, we'd drive out to the edge of town and watch the stars, talking about the future. A future we were no longer afraid to imagine. Ethan came by one afternoon. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't angry either. He and Riley talked on the porch while I gave them space. When they finally came inside, Ethan just nodded at me, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe understanding. And that was enough. Time moved forward quietly the way it always does. Sometimes, I'd wake before dawn, the world still dark and soft, and find Riley asleep beside me, his hand resting against my chest, his breathing steady. And I'd think about everything we'd gone through, all the detours and mistakes and silences that led us here. And every time, I'd reach for his hand, hold it tight, and whisper to the dark, "You were always worth it." One evening, as the last light faded behind the hills, Riley turned to me and said, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" I thought about it, about the years we'd lost, the people we'd hurt, the pain we could have avoided. And then I looked at him, the man who'd waited, the one I'd finally stopped running from, and said, "No, because even if I could change it, I'd still find my way back to you." He smiled, eyes glistening. "You always know what to say, only when it's true." He leaned in and kissed me, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that didn't demand promises, only presence, only truth. And for the first time in our story, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like coming home.